everybody. Welcome back to Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines. I'm your host, David Thompson. Today I'm joined by Dr. Jaime Martinez, who is an assistant professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke, and the author of Confederate Slave Impressment in the Upper South, which is now out with the University of North Carolina Press. So, Dr. Martinez, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
If you don't mind, could you perhaps start us just with a bit of a general overview of what this book's really about?
Well, the book started when I was doing some research on slave hiring and slave sales in Virginia during the Civil War, and everyone kept saying, we can't find field hands because the government is impressing them. And the Confederate government impressed all sorts of things. They took people's horses, they took their mules, they took food, wagons, anything that they could use for military purposes, including slaves, which I kind of knew instinctively they must have, but I didn't think about too much until that point. I found a few studies that dealt with slave impressment, and they all said it didn't work. So I was confused because all these people were saying they can't find farm laborers, they can't find field hands because the government is impressing slaves, and yet everyone who studied slave impressment said it didn't work at all. So that gave me a good sort of question to find out what happened. And so the book is about the way that the state governments in North Carolina and Virginia cooperated with the federal government and with local governments to enforce slave impressment, to get slaves from their owners, hundreds at a time, collected at the county level, taken to various points of fortification in Virginia, Richmond certainly, but also Petersburg, Lynchburg, Saltville, all of the railroad lines, all of the main railroad depots need to be fortified. Wilmington in North Carolina is a key point. And how you get the slaves together, get them there, take care of them, feed them, put them to work, house them, and then get them back home at the end. So it's about the way the Confederate government used slave labor to support military operations, but it's also about the way that the various levels of the Confederate government worked together. And what I find is that it was pretty successful, at least in Virginia and North Carolina.
Now, you've laid it out here, but also it's clear in the book that this is obviously a process that evolves over time, and that there really are stages to this. So I wondered, how did it first come to be in the early war period? I mean, really the first 2 years is kind of your first phase, if you will, that you kind of readily identify. What was the kind of impressment policies like at that point, and how did it really function on a day-to-day level?
Well, there weren't policies early on, at least not specific to military impressment. It was fairly common in slaveholding states for counties to be allowed to what they called labor levies, basically tell the slave owners, we need 200 slaves to show up for a week to fix a bridge or to build this road that is, and so the state laws allowed for that. And I think what Confederate commanders and state level engineer officers did early on was just kind of use that concept and say, well, we are going to do the same thing. We're just going to use it for Confederate purposes. And the Virginia state government said, go for it. Right, and told people you are expected to comply. The North Carolina interim governor at the time, Henry Clark, said, I don't know if this is legal. I don't know if it's a good idea. I think people should comply with these requests, but you're not legally obligated to do so. And that caused some problems. And so it became necessary to pass state laws saying Confederate officials can force you to send your slaves to do work for the army.
And once these slaves are actually being impressed, what is the labor situation like for these slaves? I mean, I would imagine people would have a fairly good indicator of what life might be like, but what did you find kind of in the process of you doing your research?
So they're going to these places, and one of the things I looked at was a treatise on field fortification that was given to every West Point officer in the 1850s, and what the Confederate Engineer Corps was using as well. And their recommendation was that you dig 6 feet down, 6 feet across, pile the dirt up 6 feet above the ground level. So you basically are 12 feet from top to bottom, from the top of the wall to the bottom of the trench. And they said, in ordinary soil, and I'm not sure what constitutes ordinary soil, and there's certainly great variation because down at Wilmington they're digging in sand primarily. And there's clay soil in Piedmont versus very different soils throughout both these states. What did they? I'm trying 8 cubic yards. A three-person team of workers could move 8 cubic yards. I'm getting the number wrong, but I sat down with a civil engineer and said, how much does a cubic foot of soil weigh? And calculated out to this 3-team group of people was moving 8 tons of dirt every day. And they did that 18 hours a day sometimes, 14 to 18 hours a day for 2 months straight. And then went to a tent and slept, in a tent on the ground. They were getting fed the standard Army ration, which was, a pound of meal, or a pound and a quarter, I think, at one point, and a third a pound of salt pork every day, and that was all they got. And they were constantly guarded, so unlike Confederate soldiers who managed to get out and find other food sources when they could, the slaves didn't really have that option. So they were stuck with the standard Army ration, and they were really working very hard in that 2-month period. And so a lot of people came back sick, hurt. They did have medical care, and it was very important if you're going to get Confederate slaveholders to give up their slaves, to make sure that they were going to be well cared for. But still, it was, in terms of just resources and how the Confederacy was going to expend its limited manpower, making sure that the slaves got top-notch medical care wasn't high on anyone's list of priorities.
Now, how do the state governments in Virginia and North Carolina effectively play this balancing act, of, if you will, of trying to adhere to the needs of the Confederate Army, while also being cognizant of the fact that they're at times depriving their citizens of labor, particularly at times, say, near harvest, when the foodstuffs are important, food that perhaps would ultimately be consumed by the Army. So how do the states kind of weigh the needs of the Army versus the needs of their own citizenry, which are indirectly, impacting these other groups?
Well, one of the things that they tried to do in that, the Virginia governors did really well because they cooperated very effectively with the Engineer Department and with the War Department as a whole, is time out the big impressment calls. Now, the first round comes in October, November 1862, and everyone just goes up in arms. We're pulling in the harvest. This is a bad time. So what we'll see is later calls tend to focus on months when there isn't a big harvest going on. And a lot of studies of agricultural slavery that have been, come out in recent years have focused on the fact that in between planting and harvest, women did most of the field work. Men were off doing other things, enslaved men. They were fixing fences, they were taking care of animals, they were transporting stuff. They were certainly working, but they weren't working the crop. And so if the priority is the crop, you can pull the men out for 2 months while the crop is actually in the field and it just needs to kind of be weeded and tended, which was women's job anyway, and still get the crop planted and harvested on either end. So Virginia did that very well. North Carolina tried, but what they kept running into is that General Whiting in Wilmington would get the slaves at a 2-month period when it was reasonably convenient and then refuse to send them home at the end of those 2 months.
Now, as we move towards the end of the war, things are really starting to become dire for the Confederacy. You start to see kind of a shift in impressment from a state level to the national level. The Confederate government kind of taking full control, really, of these policies. How does this action impact kind of the relationship of the state to its citizenry in the Confederacy? Something that we all know, at least by perception, was supposed to be something that had a relatively decentralized form of government compared to the former Union that it was a part of.
Well, and this process with impressment, that it becomes more centralized over time, really mirrors just about every other aspect of government. And so the Confederate government is actually much more centralized by 1863, certainly 1864, than the United States government is, certainly than the pre-war United States government had been. What's interesting is that immediately the shift doesn't really have a lot of impact in Virginia and North Carolina, because the first round of Confederate impressment legislation said, we will respect state laws that already exist. So the 6 states that have impressment laws will work within the boundaries of those existing laws. It's only the 5 states that don't have impressment laws, like South Carolina, for example, that are going to follow the exact terms of the national law. So not much changed in Virginia and North Carolina at first. Now, eventually you get this big call in the summer of 1864 for 20,000 slaves. And in Virginia, that's a quarter of those come from Virginia. And all of a sudden, instead of your local elected officials in Virginia, your local county court had been doing the collecting. The county court had decided who was going to go and who's going to send their slaves. The sheriff and his deputies had gone around to get people. In the summer of 1864, there's a new round of laws, a new round of quotas, and all of a sudden it's the Confederate Conscript Bureau that's coming and collecting the slaves. And that's a big difference for Virginians because they had some control over the county court. Right? In the end of the county court, the officers do something they hate. They can elect new ones. Right? But they can't control the Conscript Bureau officers. In North Carolina, I think the shift was less obvious because the county militia had been collecting the slaves, and you knew your county militia officers probably, but they were not particularly willing to negotiate on slave impressment. It was hard to get out of slave impressment in North Carolina, much harder than in Virginia. So the experience probably didn't change as much for North Carolinians because the process of collection looked very similar. It was different people, but the reality of really not being able to object in the same way Virginians could. Now, Virginia had lower compliance rates but higher quotas, so total number of Virginians who sent their Virginia slaves who were sent and was still much higher, but they never achieved perfect compliance, whereas North Carolina hit almost 100% compliance in every impressment call because the militia went around and was collecting the slaves at gunpoint. So there wasn't much you could do to resist.
Now, to shift gears just slightly here away from your research and into the classroom, when you have the opportunity to teach a course on the Civil War, is there any one particular element or a theme that you like to kind of hone in on and to impart to your students, either at the beginning of the course or something that you can see that kind of threads its way throughout?
There probably should be. I don't know that there is. I certainly, when I talk about and the way that this research project has affected, when I talk about slavery in the Confederacy, when I talk about slavery in the antebellum period, I talk about how effective it was economically. I talk about how it was evolving to adapt to a new economy. And so, in particular, I don't present that kind of clash of civilizations, Beardian kind of, I try to overturn that. And I think a lot of our students still have that sense that it's an industrial North versus an agrarian South. And, yes, but the South was industrializing and people were really willing to accept and embrace new technology and new ideas as long as it worked with the institution of slavery. And so I really try to emphasize how committed they were to preserving slavery and yet how willing they were to modernize. And I think that plays into how I teach the Confederate experience because I definitely talk about the effectiveness of the Confederate War Department and the railroads, taking over the railroads and the great job they did with ordnance and guns and all that kind of stuff that I think takes a lot of people by surprise because they assume that this is this, massive industrial Goliath versus David with the slingshot, and that's not really what it was.
Is there a recent Civil War work that you might recommend to our viewers, something that really has caught your eye recently, I suppose?
Well, I'm actually teaching a course this semester on Civil War memory, which, has been a big field for the last 15 years or so, and with the whole anniversary is especially interesting. And so I've been really enjoying, as I'm prepping for class, Barbara Gannon's book on the GAR, and also Carrie Janney's new book, the sort of synthesis that I didn't have my students read, but I did have them in lieu of our snow day yesterday, watch a recent lecture she gave that they could get on C-SPAN. So I think we're enjoying the new stuff on memory a lot.
And I should also, shameless plug, Dr. Gannon and Dr. Janie have both been on before with us to talk about their respective books, The One Cause and Remembering the Civil War. So if you want to catch those interviews, we always have them archived on our website. Just a little plug for us. Finally, Dr. Martinez, before I let you go, is there a new project in the works here that you might be willing to speak about?
Possibly. I mean, I have a lot of ideas. I don't quite know where I'm going to go yet, but a couple of the things that have come up for me on this first project is this idea that somehow that I encounter with students and even my friends in the English department who are 19th century literature scholars that slavery was dying, that it wasn't a vital institution, and I don't see that in the 1850s. I see it being very vital economically, culturally, socially, and people really being committed to preserving it. So I've been thinking about a book that tries to get at that in a way that is accessible. I've been thinking about where I am, which is southeastern North Carolina, and so I'm looking into possibly writing a history of slavery and emancipation in Wilmington area from 1850 through about 1870. So one of the other things that I've come across is a lot of books that deal with slavery stop in 1860. A lot of books that deal with emancipation and Reconstruction start in the middle of the war, 1865. There aren't a whole lot that go late antebellum through the war and into early Reconstruction, and I think we might be missing some stories and some potential interpretations if we don't think across the period.
Well, fair enough. It sounds like an intriguing project. Thank you so much for coming on today, Dr. Martinez. Again, the book is Confederate Slave Impressment in the Upper South, now out with UNC Press. As Dr. Martinez pointed out at the beginning of this interview, she is really trying to explain to everybody how impressment actually was successful, contrary to what many have believed and historians may have implied in the past. So pick up the book. It's well worth a read, and it's very enjoyable. So Dr. Martinez, again, thanks so much, and hopefully we can have you on again in the future.
Thank you.